Welcome back to the Stack Shack Sports Show. So glad that you all are tuning in today. Apologies, it's been a minute since we posted. I took some vacation off for Thanksgiving and a few other big recording projects for a couple of my other YouTube channels. Links will be in the description if you're interested in some of the other things I've got going on this year. But we come back and we got a banger. We got a banger today. The college football rankings are back. Apologies for the no face cam today. I just got back, so I'm still unpacking things. The room's a bit of a mess at the moment. But I wanted to get this video out today. And that is, we got the top 25 rankings, and there is a whole lot of controversy. And so I'm going to lend my voice to that controversy and ramp it up a little bit myself. Something right off the bat, let's just look at this. The big topic. The top four teams: Michigan 1, Washington 2, Texas 3, Alabama 4, and Florida State 5. Those 5 teams is where all the arguing is going on. There's even some slight rumors that Florida State might sue. I don't see that happening, but I don't know. That's a rumor out there. Alabama gets in over Florida State. Interesting to note that the AP did their top 25, and top 4 is a little different. With the AP poll, Florida State actually got number 4. So all those people out there saying, hey, the majority of people thought Alabama should be 4, well, according to all the rankings by all voters in the AP, and if you're curious who votes on the AP poll, well, it's about 63 individuals. They're writers and broadcasters who cover college football for organizations that are members of the Associated Press. Every single state with a bowl subdivision, meaning an FBS team, is represented by at least one voter. More voters increases with the number of FBS teams, and then some national voters are reserved as well. And they vote. It's a 1 to 25 point system. Number 1 gets 25 points all the way down, right? And they calculate that out. And that's where you get this points total here on the right side on the AP website. 1358, 1329. That's close. But also, that's close too, right? Texas and Florida State is close. I think it is interesting that the AP puts Florida State in. The playoff committee puts Alabama in. And why I think this is super interesting is that if you listen to the side that is pro-Alabama, you will hear that, it was all of the people that really watch the sport, that are really fans, that really know what they're talking about. It's the prognosticators that are talking down to the fans and saying, oh, hey, no, the committee got it right. It needs to be Alabama. But in their own poll, where you get all of those broadcasters, that wasn't true. So don't let anybody tell you that, the vast majority of people think it was supposed to be Alabama. This representative group did not put Alabama in the top 4. I think that's interesting. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about what my opinion is. I've actually flip-flopped a little bit on this issue. We've had, coming in to Friday or Saturday night, I'd just seen Alabama beat Georgia, and I was very interested to see how Florida State would do. When the Jordan Travis injury occurred, I said, well, there goes Florida State. They're not going to make the playoff anymore. We can't put them in. But I kind of expected them to lose either at Florida, which is a tough team to play on the road, or in the ACC title game against a team in Louisville that has played well and beaten some pretty solid teams in their route to getting to the ACC championship. Now, they stumbled twice against teams that really, on paper, they should have beat. But regardless, they did do what they needed to do to get to the ACC championship game, and they beat some teams along the way. You know, they beat a Notre Dame team, they beat a Kentucky team, they beat an NC State team. Those are decent teams. Even Miami, at the time that they played them towards the end of the year with their quarterback not hurt, I mean, that was a team that was ranked earlier in the season as well. So they had some decent wins. I thought they would beat Florida State. They did not. So injury happens. I go, there's no way Florida State can get in. You can't do that. Then we move along, and I watch Alabama upset Georgia. I go, well, Georgia can't be in my opinion, in that moment, and I've kind of been on that train all year. Georgia didn't play anybody. I know they have some wins against teams in the SEC this season on their schedule, but everybody will admit that the SEC was not as good as they typically are. Even if you look at the ACC versus the SEC, I think the record was 6-4. ACC beat the SEC 6 times and only lost 4 times when those matchups were happening. I think that might be something you should look at when dealing with ACC versus SEC difficulty of schedule. I know Florida State does not have a difficult schedule. At least it's not ranked well on strength of schedule, but I think an SEC schedule like Georgia's, it might be a little overrated. Both of them are quite far down. Alabama has a higher strength of schedule because they played Texas. They obviously did not beat Texas, so that, yeah, they have a harder strength of schedule, but that's also why they have a loss, right? Whereas Florida State is unbeaten. So this is something that has never happened before, that we had an unbeaten conference champion get left out. And going into yesterday, I thought, well, I think if Alabama beats Georgia, which I felt that Texas this entire time has been getting snubbed. They had one loss. They beat an Alabama team in Alabama, and their one loss came kind of at a last-second moment, and everybody is talking about Oregon, right? Oh, Oregon. What about Texas? Where was all the talk about Texas? It was, oh, Oregon, Washington, winners getting in. Okay, so you're just automatically saying Oregon is better than than Texas when Texas has a better out-of-conference win by far. And they both have in-conference rivalry game losses basically in the last seconds. I was always confused by that people had totally forgotten about Texas. So I was really rooting, kind of personally, for Alabama to beat Georgia because I wanted to see Texas in. I felt like they deserved it. I felt like their body of work this season made them one of the 4 best teams. And so I was hoping that Georgia would finally fall, because I have not been a Georgia believer all season. I've been talking about the lack of competitiveness in their opponents. I just don't think Tennessee, I don't think Ole Miss, I don't think those are big, good wins. They're reasonable teams, but they didn't have a marquee matchup, a matchup I didn't feel like they ever ran into a team during their season that could actually compete realistically with them. Alabama was going to be the only one. At the beginning of the season, I thought they might not have a single top 25 win. Now, Tennessee somehow stayed in the top 25. Go ask Joel Klatt how he feels about that. And Ole Miss stays there as well. Way up. I don't think Ole Miss is the 11th ranked team in the country, but alas, there you go. So back to our storyline. Florida State Travis gets hurt. I go, there's no way. They're going to lose potentially both of these next games. I just didn't think they had it. Well, then they beat Florida. Now, it wasn't pretty, but they beat Florida. So I went, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then we come to Conference Championship weekend. Alabama does beat Georgia. I'm like, there you go. Texas is in. When that happened, Texas to me was a lock. There's no way you don't put Texas in. Because if you're going to leave Texas out, that would mean Alabama and Florida State would have to get in ahead of them. And the Texas win only looks better against Alabama after they beat Georgia. Texas is the Big 12 champion, and they beat the SEC champion on the road in Tuscaloosa. So I felt like Michigan, Washington, and Texas were a lock going into the evening games. Now, if Michigan stumbled against Iowa, maybe, but did any of us actually believe Iowa had a chance in that game? I don't think so. The Washington had already won. Texas had already won. Michigan was basically a done deal. So those three teams to me were a lock, and it came down to the 4 and 5. And so I went into the last game going, I don't think they can put an SEC team in if Florida State wins. That was my feeling. Florida State, undefeated, ACC Power 5 champion. I don't think you can leave them out if they do that. You know, we all talk about the Cardell Jones Ohio State team, right? So I go into to Saturday night saying Florida State wins this game, they're in over Alabama. Well, I watched that game. And while Florida State does win that game, it was ugly. I mean, they just were struggling to move the ball. Their defense played lights out. Lights out. It was impressive. But their offense was so hard to watch. Now, it was the third string freshman quarterback thrown in. That is a tough position for him to be playing in. And he's third string for a reason, right? Young, inexperienced. I bet only half of the playbook is available. Maybe even less, right? So they found a way to win that game. Following the ending of that game, I said, you know what? The committee has always said their goal was to get the 4 best teams. And there's always been this argument of, well, the committee is giving the 4 most deserving teams, not necessarily the 4 best. And I said, this is an opportunity for the committee to do what they've said they were always going to do. This is why we like the committee over the BCS, because it can take into considerations things like an injured quarterback. Your starting quarterback, heart and soul, your team goes down. We can take that into account. The computer probably is not going to take that into account. BCS computer definitely didn't. And so that's one of the reasons we liked. There's a bit of a divide across the country whether they still like this idea, but that is the reason we liked having a committee instead of BCS. We wanted to get rid of just this computer program that decided. And we didn't always like how it decided. So we wanted to get a few more people with real eyes, people that can actually think logically about the whole of the situation, can watch the games and decide on who they think is the top 4 and ultimately the top 25 teams. So we that's my thought Saturday night. Alabama gets in over Florida State. Florida State just doesn't look good. Then we get Sunday morning. And what happens is they put Alabama in. And I honestly will say that's by Sunday morning. Again, Saturday morning, I thought if Alabama wins, that means no SEC teams. Saturday afternoon, I was like, there's no way you can put an SEC team in. Saturday night, after watching that Florida State game, I went, okay, yeah, they're going to put Alabama in. They're just not going to put that Florida State team in. So that's Sunday morning, and it happens. They put Alabama in with 1 loss to Texas over undefeated ACC champion Florida State. One loss, Power 5 conference champion, gets in over an undefeated Power 5 conference champion. And everybody freaks out. And there's a lot of bickering on either side. At that moment, I was like, I agree with the committee. I think the committee made the right decision. Then I started doing some research. Then I started hearing the statistics and being reminded of my own points, that I didn't think Georgia was that good, that the SEC was not as productive as they typically are this season, that the ACC was 6-4 against Alabama. I'm reminded that Alabama needed a literal miracle to beat Auburn, who I think is really bad. They should have lost that game to Auburn. They got pushed all over the place. Auburn had one of the most abysmal collapses I have ever seen in a football game against Alabama, and Alabama was able to win that game. I mean, we're talking about 4th and 37, throw it to the corner of the end zone, and the dude's wide open. We're talking about a muffed punt to even set up that opportunity. It's ridiculous. And now I've come full circle. This is ridiculous that Alabama got in over Florida State. And we'll just go through this here. So I understand, and this is the argument I was making. You lose Jordan Travis. Heartbreaking. And I want to say before we get into these numbers and before I really build my case, if you are an Alabama fan, you have every right to be politicking for your team. Nick Saban coming and saying it would be a travesty to leave an SEC champion out. It's never happened before. That's fair. That's fair, right? You can't leave us out. We're the SEC champions. We only have one loss. You got to put us in. We've gotten better over the season. All of those arguments are valid, and the different commissioners all talking and politicking, and the coaches and everybody. Obviously, your coach, Kirby Smart, coming out and saying, well, if you want the 4 best teams, I think my team's one of the 4 best teams. Sure, of course you think that. You have to think that. You have to say that as a coach. So let's just ignore that. Florida State, some very impassioned comments. I happen to agree with them a little bit more, but I do love to see that amount of passion in college football. So that is good. But let's build the case for Florida State here. So what we are saying by putting Alabama in over Florida State is we are saying the Jordan Travis injury means that Alabama is better than Florida State, because I don't think anybody, including the committee chair, when they asked him, would have ever put Alabama over Florida State should Jordan Travis still be playing. Never would have happened. So that's all we're looking at. They would not have put Alabama over Florida State if Jordan Travis is still playing. That singular injury is the whole entire reason Alabama is in the top 4 from the committee's perspective. And here's why I think that is complete BS. You can say, oh, Florida State looked kind of ugly these last 2 games. They were really just hanging on. They're just finding a way to win. Well, I hate to break it to you, but just last weekend, Alabama, I would argue, needed even more luck, needed even more grit and cards falling their way to find a way to win. If Alabama blows out Auburn by 50 and then beats Georgia the way they did, I don't think I have this same, frustration. Texas, Washington. Washington hasn't won a game by over 10 points in 6 weeks. Every game in Washington is close. They're late game drives. But guess what? They get credit for winning those games. Texas. Quinn Ewers goes out, and they have some rocky moments, but the defense steps up and they get some wins. They weren't pretty. They were tight, close matchups. The only team that's really kind of won pretty significantly in most games is Michigan, but even Michigan struggled at one point against Maryland. And yet all of those teams get credit for their ugly wins. And you might argue with the Texas, with the Washington, with the Michigan. Texas, they had an injury at quarterback, they got him back. And then they were much better, and they walloped in the last few weeks of the season. They were dominant. Okay, sure, that's a fair argument to say, oh, well, it's just recent success, right? Let's look at the last couple of weeks. Alabama can't stand on that. Texas, Washington, and Michigan probably can. Washington's has some big wins, including one over Oregon, who's really good. Alabama, they have a dominant win over Georgia. And dominant may be too strong of a term, but they have a good win over Georgia. But the week before that against Auburn, ooh. And I'm sorry to break it to you, but Auburn is not as good as Louisville. I would argue that Auburn is not as good as Florida. And not only do I think Florida's probably a little better than Auburn, Florida State beat Florida by more than Alabama beat Auburn. We all do realize that, right? Florida State's margin of victory over Florida was bigger than Alabama's margin of victory over Auburn. So if we're talking style points here, ooh, it starts to really fall off. And I'm really disappointed in the committee. I feel like they really just looked at the conference championship games where Alabama looked pretty good against Georgia. And I'm not going to doubt that, deny that. I think they deserve some credit for how they played against Georgia. And the committee had ranked Georgia number 1 in the country. And Florida State didn't look great. But you know what? Florida State was playing on their third-string quarterback. Their second-string quarterback is not done for the year. He was in concussion protocol. He will be back for the bowl game. And that's the quarterback that played against Florida for most of the game, or a good chunk of it at least, before he got knocked out. And they beat a Florida team and a Louisville team. Now, do I think Louisville's probably not quite as good as Georgia? Yeah, absolutely. Georgia's better than Louisville, I think. Although, it'd be an interesting game. I would definitely watch that game. If Louisville was getting, 15 or 20, I would probably put my bet on Louisville to keep it maybe closer than most people would think, just because of my opinion of Georgia's schedule. But, all that said, you just have to realize Florida State beat Florida by a bigger margin of victory. And then they beat a Louisville team. And yet they don't get credit for winning gritty, tough, ugly. Oh, the best teams, they just find a way to win. Florida State has done that all season long and never lost. They found a way to win. Alabama didn't find a way to win against Texas. They got beat pretty handedly, and then they found a way to win their other games. But I think that has to count for something, and I think it's interesting that we talk so much about, oh, the best teams find a way to win. It doesn't matter if you win sloppy. Well, here it did. And one team got credit for their win against Auburn and finding a way to pull off a miraculous win. And another team did not get credit for finding a way to win in back-to-back games with quarterback injuries. And not just the Jordan Travis one. Remember, second-string quarterback got hurt against Florida. So they didn't have him for the ACC championship game, and they still won. I know you want to say Alabama is obviously the better team. I'm not 100% sure it is. Alabama has struggled on offense all year. That Florida State defense looks pretty darn good. Where has Alabama been pushed around a little bit? Running the ball. Auburn did it. Auburn can't throw the ball at all. Let's go look at the box scores for that game. Let's look at this game. This is a game that all of us, anybody who watched that game knows, Auburn probably should have won this game. If they don't fumble a punt deep in their own territory, they probably win this game. If the DB is a little closer to the wide receiver on 4th and 37, they don't win this. They win this game. Auburn wins. So let's look at the box scores here, because we're worried about the quarterback play from Florida State. Well, let's see how the quarterback play was for Auburn. Huh? Anybody notice this? Peyton Thorne, Auburn's quarterback, went 5 for 16 for 91 yards passing. 91 yards passing. 1 touchdown, and he threw 2 picks. Let's compare it to Florida State's third-string quarterback against Louisville, who everybody says had a good defense. 8 for 21, 55 yards, no touchdowns, no picks. It's not great. That's not good numbers. But he didn't turn the ball over. Thorne did twice. He had more completions. Less yards. Didn't throw the touchdown. Well, you're telling me that, the quarterback play from Florida State means they would never match up against Alabama. They're unequivocally, Alabama is better. Alabama struggled with another quarterback who really can't throw the ball. And this is the third-string quarterback, not the quarterback that will play. You want to know who's going to play? Rodemaker's going to play. Now, this is before he gets knocked out. So this is not a full game. But he's close to 50% completion percentage for 134 yards. That doesn't sound too terrible. They decided to run the ball in. Okay, so that's why he doesn't have a couple of passing touchdowns. They won by 9 points over Florida. Alabama won by 3 over this guy. We can't do it. So what is Alabama susceptible to? And I know we don't want to necessarily compare just these two teams. Who do we think would win? But who do we think is the better team is very closely related to who do we think would win in a straight-up matchup. And I don't think it's that clear. And unless one team is unequivocally better, I don't see a reason to put them above the unbeaten team. Alabama gets credit for beating Auburn. Florida State does not get credit for beating Louisville and Florida. And Alabama had all their players. Against Louisville, Florida State did not have all their players that they will have, or would have, for the college football playoff. That is why this is ridiculous. You can look at that conference championship game and go, yeah, I think Alabama's better. But Alabama, if we're going to penalize teams for winning ugly, or for playing teams that, are not super good close, Alabama's the poster boy for that. They barely beat Auburn. Florida State beat Florida by more. And I would equate Florida and Auburn to be somewhat similar. Alabama's struggled on offense all year. You don't think that Florida State defense would just shut down Alabama? I think it might. Alabama's been susceptible to the run this year. You know who's really good at running the football? Florida State. And as a coach, you have a third-string quarterback in there who probably, I said earlier in this show, 50% the playbooks available to him, it's very possible that it's a lot less than that. You don't expect the freshman third stringer to play. He doesn't get a lot of reps with the playbook. So it's very possible that he only has like a third, maybe even a quarter of the playbook available to him, because what is the coach going to do? Hey, you're a young kid. We're going to make things really simple. We're not going to ask much of you. We're going to try and win this game. We're going to trust our defense. We're going to run the ball. We're going to play ball control. What does Michigan do every single game? Ball control. And they get praised as this boa constrictor. Why didn't Florida State get praised as this boa constrictor that beats Florida, beats Louisville? I know you're going to say Georgia's better than Louisville. Sure. Sure. But Florida State beat Louisville by a legitimate margin, and they beat Florida by a legitimate margin. Alabama didn't beat Auburn by a legitimate margin. So that's where I flip-flopped. Travis injury, I said, Florida State, there's no way you're getting in. You're going to lose some games. Oh, you're not losing games. Alabama beats Georgia, I say, SEC, you're done. I watched the game with Florida State. And I go, I think you got to put Alabama in. Then the morning of selection day, I'm like, I think they're going to put Alabama in. Then they do. And then I go, okay, do I think that was the right decision? That's what I thought the committee would do. Then I started doing some research and really thinking about what would I do in that situation. I'm putting Florida State in. And I really am a little frustrated, to be honest, by the language from a lot of the prognosticators out there of, you guys got to stop whining in Florida. Gosh, Tallahassee, quit whining. You're just not as good as Alabama without your quarterback. It's, we're so sorry for you, but it's your reality. Yes, I do feel devastated for Florida State even before the rankings came out, because Jordan Travis is a great player and his injury was brutal, and that's just not how you wanted that season to end, right? I would have been feeling bad for them in the playoff, because I would have been, man, what if they had Travis? But you know what? They played well enough to get in. They did. They did everything they needed to do to get in. They beat every single team on their schedule. And they played a legitimate schedule. We're not talking Liberty here, where they didn't play a single good team, really. Florida State has a top 25 win. In fact, they have multiple top 25 wins. Now, you can say, those were with a different quarterback. Well, not the Louisville one, which is their best win in the top 25. They played a legitimate schedule. They won ugly. They found ways to win. Today, if Alabama and Florida State played, after actually looking at the numbers, actually thinking about this, I don't think it's a blowout. I think it's pretty close, and I might give the edge to Florida State. After seeing what Alabama struggles with, the exact thing that Florida State is going to be good at in this game. What do people always say about, how do you beat Nick Saban? Well, you got to have really good playmakers. You know who has some of the best playmakers? Definitely better playmakers than Alabama. Florida State. Those wide receivers are dudes, and that running back is legit. It's really, really sad. I've come full circle on it. I'm convinced this is ridiculous. Now, this is why I've been calling for a 12-team playoff for a long time. It made no sense that there were only 4 spots for really every year at the beginning of the year, essentially 6 teams, because you've got the Power 5 conference champion is going to come out, and then Notre Dame if they're good. Now, thankfully for the committee, Notre Dame was not super good this year. Otherwise, this would be even worse. Although maybe it would be better, because if Notre Dame had run their entire table and were undefeated, maybe they would have put them in and not Alabama or Florida State. But even then, I think Florida State would be really pissed off in that case as well. So be thankful, committee, that Notre Dame decided to drop a couple of games there. But it made no sense from the very beginning to me. 4 teams, but we have 5 Power 5 conferences. We have an independent in Notre Dame that's pretty good. And normally, I wouldn't say it really happened this year, but typically in years past, there's been a group of 5 team, a UCF team, a Cincinnati team that seems to be somewhat decent, a Boise State team many years ago. And I'm not saying that those group of 5 teams, should always get in. Cincinnati obviously got absolutely boat raced. We can see. But there's going to be 5 teams every year that have played a legitimate schedule. It's honestly, to me, kind of a miracle this hasn't happened more. That we've gotten into a situation where it was really tough to pick the top 4 teams. It's really funny. Last year, what was the team that everybody thought shouldn't have been there? TCU. And everybody wants to talk about how they got rolled by Georgia, which they did. But you know what nobody's talking about? The fact that TCU beat Michigan. The team that everybody was like, this year, we could go back to the BCS. It's really just Michigan and Georgia. And TCU comes in and kind of rocked Michigan's world a little bit. I think that's a travesty. You don't put Florida State in here. Let me know in the comments what you think. I think the AP poll got it right. I think the prognosticators out there saying, everybody agrees that Alabama's better than Florida State. Well, when they asked the sports broadcasters and writers to rank the teams, guess who popped up at number 4? Florida State. Interestingly enough, it's a closer margin, isn't it? Oh, no, it's not. 25. This is less than 25. This is less than 25. It's 4 less. This is 2 less. Okay, never mind. Florida State popped up in 4. That means when the writers got together, ranked them 1 to 25, Florida State got more points. Playoff selection committee didn't agree. I think that's unfortunate. Next year, we won't have to deal with this. Next year, it'll be a 12-team playoff. Now, Oklahoma would not get in, and Liberty would, because Liberty would be the highest group of 5 conference champion. But, we're having an argument over Liberty and Oklahoma. Hey, Oklahoma, win a couple of more games. This will never happen again with a 12-team playoff. We will never again have an undefeated Power 5 conference champion. Now, it's going to the Power, I don't know, what are we going to call them? The Power 4, Power 2 next year? But a legitimate conference champion, undefeated, will always get in a 12-team playoff. And that's the stupidity of this playoff setup from the beginning. Because from the beginning, there was an opportunity for there to be 5 undefeated conference champions. The committee is just lucky that this really difficult situation where a team gets left out hasn't happened more times than it did in its 10-year run or whatever it's been. The only times there's been truly like a really big deal over, man, you left a team out, was TCU in that first year. Since then, there's always debate between 4 and 5, but mostly it's kind of worked itself out. A couple of teams have played head-to-head. This year, it did not. Texas played Alabama. That was helpful. Because if Texas didn't play Alabama, this would be even harder. Think about it. If Texas doesn't beat Alabama, Alabama's undefeated. Like, they don't play. They both choose to play some FCS schools or whatever. Alabama's undefeated. And I appreciate that they're giving Alabama credit for playing a good, tough, out-of-conference game. Sure, absolutely. Go for it. Give them credit for that. But you're just in an unfortunate situation where Florida State, they, were undefeated this year. But if Texas doesn't play Alabama, then you might have a one-loss Texas team. Only lost to Oklahoma. How's that one going to work out for you? Still going to be in the same problem that you're in right now. A really good team's going to get left out. And that's the unfortunate part. We always said from the beginning, 4 teams, not enough to know for sure that we have the best team. That UCF team a few years ago is pretty good. They won all their games, and they did win their bowl game against a legitimate opponent. So they proved that they had some things. They were pretty good. I don't think that UCF team was as good as that TCU team was. I still stand by the fact that I think that TCU team might have won it all that year. But they got left out. But this has never happened. Undefeated conference champion. Even then, you had an argument to be like, well, TCU, you're not undefeated. This time, Florida State's undefeated. Even then, you could have pointed to something, and it at least sat a little better of like, just win your games. You could have won all your games, and you would have been in, TCU. All right, well, bummer. We did lose a game. That's fair. We did lose a game. Florida State, we didn't lose a game. And we played legitimate opponents. This isn't Cincinnati. This isn't UCF. We played everybody you wanted us to play. And we beat them all. And we beat multiple top 25 teams. Those UCF and Cincinnati teams didn't have a bunch of top 25 wins. Maybe they had 1 or 2, maybe. They didn't have 3. And one of Florida State's wins is with the new quarterback situation. And really worse than the new quarterback situation because it's the third-string freshman, not the second-string guy who threw for 150 yards against Florida before they knocked him out of the game. I don't know. It's a sad day in college football. I cannot imagine being a Seminoles fan right now. It would be brutal. And to say that everybody agreed that Alabama was better, and the AP poll definitely says it's not. So that's a flat out lie. Florida State has every right to be pissed off. They should have put Florida State in. It would have been easier to justify. Alabama beat Texas and you're in. You didn't beat Texas, you don't get to go in because Florida State's undefeated. We got to give them a shot. Florida State, win ugly. Alabama, oh, well, they won ugly. They won on a last-second 4th and 37 fling to the corner of the end zone after a muffed punt. Oh, yeah, that Alabama team's really good. Just watch these two teams play the last 2 weeks. Well, both weeks, Florida State looked somewhat in control and dominant. Even though the score wasn't a complete blowout, although they were bigger margins of victory than Alabama had, they were good. Florida State did good. Well, one week Alabama looked awful. Like they should have lost to a 6-6 Auburn team. And the next week, they looked pretty good as they beat Georgia. Now, Georgia is better than Louisville, I think. But we've been talking about this all along. Georgia didn't play anybody this season. We don't know how good Georgia is. It's going to be an interesting game. I'm glad that 5 and 6 are playing each other. But if everybody plays for those two teams, which I don't know if they will, Bowers might sit out or something might happen. But if they all play, Florida State, go out there and wallop Georgia. That's what I'm hoping for. And that committee better be bowing their heads in shame when that happens. Now, the committee is praying and hoping that Georgia rolls on Florida State in that bowl game. Because then it will be, all right, Florida State was not as good. But if what happens this season is what happened back in 2014 with TCU, committee got it wrong. Committee got it wrong. And this time I think is even more egregious than back then. And I was on the put Alabama in over Florida State train until I actually looked at the information in front of me. Until I was reminded, oh yeah, that Auburn game. Oh yeah, you don't need to throw for any yards. What did he throw, 9,500 yards? We looked at it. You don't have to throw for 100 yards. Everybody kept making it a big deal out of, oh, that Florida State offense, he threw for 55 yards. That's ridiculous. Yeah, well, Auburn should have beat Alabama, and they threw for 91. That Florida State team, that backup quarterback before he got hurt, threw for 134. That seems pretty good. It's better than Peyton Thorne did. And he didn't throw a pick, and neither did the freshman throw a pick. Thorne threw 2 picks. And they still should have beat Alabama. Because they ran all over them. And that's what Florida State has done to 2 teams in a row. To Florida, 95 yards and 3 touchdowns rushing. Look at total yards. 224 total yards. It was a battle. It's a rivalry game. It was at Florida. Same here. You're at Auburn. It's a rivalry game. I'll give you that. But this team should have beat you. So leave the conversation if you're just going to talk about, oh, they didn't throw for enough yards on offense. What are you talking about? Auburn showed that you could beat Alabama by throwing it less than Florida State is going to be capable of throwing it. And turning the ball over a bunch. Florida State played a clean game and they beat Louisville. And they don't get credit for it. It's ridiculous. I'm done ranting for now. See y'all tomorrow. We'll maybe talk some NFL and my blood can stop boiling.